Welcome to episode 6 in our video series about the Founding Fathers of the United States of America. Now, if you've been watching the prior videos in the series, you know that this video series is not some dull and boring recitation of facts, but instead, we are having some fun here. So we are considering the context at the time and the situations that were actually confronting our founding fathers. And we're learning what our founding fathers believed and what our founding fathers did. So as a result, we are learning about these people. We are learning what these people were really like as human beings. And as a little added bonus, we are also gaining a wonderful appreciation about the fascinating story of the founding of this nation. So in prior videos, we established our big board. And our big board is what we are using to keep track of the 5 central founding fathers that we are considering in this video series. So we've got Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Adams, and Jefferson. In prior videos, we saw how the government sort of came to be, how it was created, how the Constitution was created. In fact, the Constitution was created right here in this room, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So now that the Constitution has been created and ratified by the states, now what? Well, now there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done because these new representatives, they need to basically set up the entire government from scratch. So there is a ton of work that needs to be done. So let's pick up our story there and jump right into episode 6. Now that this brand new Constitution had just been ratified, the first Congress had a ton of work cut out for them because they had to set up this entirely new government. But they also had to elect a president, right? They had to elect the first president of the United States. Okay, so it was pretty much a given fact that the first president of the United States would be George Washington. Okay, pretty much everybody wanted George Washington to be president. And the reason for this is because, remember, this is a brand new government. Okay, nobody really knew whether it was going to take effect across the land, whether it would actually work. You know, would people respect it and believe in it? Well, in order to have people believe in it and to have this thing work, you really needed the first president to be somebody that all the people across all 13 states believed in and trusted and honored. And this was none other than George Washington. I mean, George Washington was like the most famous guy in the country and the most respected and revered and all of that. So it almost had to be George Washington as the first president. So the way the presidential elections worked back then is that there were no political parties. Okay, so they did not have the Republicans and the Democrats. You didn't have two parties. There were no parties. And in fact, this is the way the Founding Fathers wanted it. They did not want parties. They thought that parties were going to create all sorts of problems because they'll be fighting with each other and there'll be internal conflicts and all of that, which of course we see today in the Republicans and Democrats. So they did not want political parties. So this is one of the reasons why everybody was able to get behind George Washington, right? Because you didn't have two political parties running their own separate candidates. So everyone was just doing what was right, what was best. And so everyone got behind George Washington. So it was fine. So then the question is, okay, well, what about the vice president? Who will become the first vice president? Well, the way they set this up back then is that the vice president will just be the person who comes in second, the candidate who comes in second. So today it's different. So today there's a ticket, right? Today there's the candidate for president and the vice president, and you vote for both at the same time. You vote for that ticket. But that's not how it was back then. So back then there were just a bunch of candidates and you voted for whoever you wanted to vote for, and the person who got the most votes would become president, and the person who got the second most votes would become vice president. Okay, and if you think about it back then, with no political parties, it made some sense because this is how you get the two best people, right? The best person who gets the most votes is president, and the second best person who gets the second most votes becomes vice president. Makes sense. So that's what they did. So the first presidential election was held in 1788. Okay, and what happened was George Washington was elected president. So George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. And who came in second place? John Adams. So John Adams now becomes George Washington's vice president. And John Adams becomes the first vice president of the United States. So George Washington becomes the first president of the United States. Now let's signify that with a little number 1 here under his name. So that number 1 signifies he's the first president of the United States. So John Adams was his vice president. So John Adams was the first vice president of the United States. So what happened with these other guys? Well, Washington appoints Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury. So Hamilton becomes part of the Washington administration as the first Secretary of the Treasury. Washington also appoints Thomas Jefferson to be the Secretary of State. So Jefferson joins the Washington administration as the first Secretary of State. And James Madison ends up running for Congress and winning. So he becomes elected to the United States House of Representatives as the representative for Virginia. So this seems like a pretty powerful team here. But let's take a second here and remember their histories. So remember, back at the time of the Revolutionary War, it's a dozen years ago, it was John Adams and Thomas Jefferson who were really close. They developed a close bond. And remember, it was Adams who arranged to have Jefferson be the drafter of the Declaration of Independence. And that proved to be one of Jefferson's most proudest achievements. So these two were really close back then. And remember the relationship between Washington and Hamilton. So Washington was the head of the Continental Army fighting the Revolution to kick Britain out. And Washington is about 25 years older than Hamilton. Washington hired Hamilton as one of Washington's senior aides, and they became close. And they formed this tight bond because they experienced this war together, and they saw how frustrating it was to have a loose federal government under the Articles of Confederation. So they developed this sort of bond together for the need of a strong centralized federal government. In fact, let's put a connector here up between Washington and Hamilton just to show that they had this strong bond together for this desire for a strong centralized federal government. And this was a result of their shared experience during the war together. So then you had Madison, and he was born in Virginia close to Jefferson. So their two family plantations were nearby to each other. They were like neighbors. So when Madison returned from Princeton College, he joined the Virginia legislature and became a protege of Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson was around 8 years older than Madison, and Jefferson became a mentor to James Madison. And those two formed a friendship, which ended up becoming a lifelong friendship. But then skip ahead to the Constitutional Convention when it becomes time to draft the Constitution. Now remember, these two guys were out of the picture because they were both serving as foreign ministers. Adams was the foreign minister to England, so he was living in London, and Jefferson was the foreign minister to France, so he was living in Paris. So they were not part of the Constitutional Convention. Although they did approve of it, they wrote letters back saying this is a great thing. But it is these two guys who end up hooking up with each other. So Madison and Hamilton emerge as the central figures advocating for a strong central federal government. So Madison becomes the father of the Constitution, the drafter and the genius and the force behind the Constitution, which is along the lines of Hamilton's belief for a strong centralized federal government. So these two then form a bond. And remember, these two wrote the Federalist Papers together, right? So over the year after the Constitution was drafted, they together wrote those 85 papers, the Federalist Papers, trying to persuade the states to approve the Constitution. So these two had a strong relationship. So there are a lot of fascinating relationships here among these founding fathers. But then skip ahead to the time period that we're at right now, which is the formation of the first government. So George Washington is the first president of the United States. John Adams is the vice president. Alexander Hamilton is the Secretary of Treasury. Thomas Jefferson is the Secretary of State. And James Madison is serving in the Congress. All right, so this seems like a dream team here, right? Quite a force. So it seems like maybe everything's going to be happy ever after now, right? Because you got all these guys together here, one big happy family. This is going to be a great government that all moves in the same direction. But unfortunately, it was not to be. So what ended up happening is political parties began to emerge. Now remember, the founding fathers did not want political parties. They were opposed to political parties. But nonetheless, political parties sort of began to form on their own. So as these guys started, working in government and pursuing what they thought would be best for the nation, it turned out that they had differences and they ended up going in different directions. And that is how these political parties sort of began to form on their own. So Alexander Hamilton emerged as the leader of the Federalist Party. So that was one party. And the other party who was opposed to that was Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson emerged as the leader of the Democratic Republican Party. Now, I have to say, I hate that name, Democratic Republican Party. It's Democratic-Republican Party, because it suggests that it's two parties, but it wasn't. It was just one party. And it's also confusing because it has the same names as today's political parties, the Democrats and Republicans. But there was no connection. This was really its own separate party back at the day. The issues were different. So you have to think of it as its own separate party, even though the name is, sounds familiar and it's very confusing. But I'm going to stick with using that name because that is sort of the convention that has developed for referring to this party. So you have these two opposing parties here. So let's insert a red curved line here to signify that there was a conflict here between these two parties. So this red curved line signifies the conflict, and on either end you have the two opposing parties. So on the one hand, you've got Hamilton as the leader of the Federalist Party, and on the other hand, you have Jefferson as the leader of the Democratic Republican Party. So what were the differences between these two parties, between Hamilton and his Federalists and Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans? So one huge difference, and this is sort of an overarching difference that encompasses so many individual issues under it. One overarching difference was the size and the scope of the federal government. So Hamilton and his Federalists were envisioning this big federal government, and Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans were envisioning local and individual liberties. Now this idea sort of goes to the overall differing philosophies between these two men, Hamilton and Jefferson. So they had very different perspectives of the world and thus very different perspectives of what this nation should be. So Hamilton had this idea that the government should be this enormous federal government, that the federal government should, come together, so join all the states together and then create this strong central federal government. And the purpose of the federal government would then be to turn around and use its power in order to help everyone in the various states. So the federal government would be used to help stimulate the economy. It would be used to help develop industry, to help develop manufacturing, to help build roads and bridges throughout the nation in order to facilitate commerce. So Hamilton was envisioning that you need this strong federal government in order to develop this nation, in order to spur industry and spur innovation and spur economic development. And this would result in great economic prosperity and the creation of wealth. But it all needed to be done by a strong federal government, sort of like the backbone. Federal government would be the backbone of this nation that would lead to the development of industry and economic prosperity. So that was Hamilton's big vision. This is why he wanted to create this strong federal government. Jefferson, on the other hand, had a very different philosophical perspective on the world. In his view, the idea is that happiness is achieved through individual liberty and the pursuit of one's individual happiness. So this was very focused on the individual, and thus he was threatened. Jefferson was threatened by the notion of a sort of overarching federal power, because he was concerned that that federal power would infringe upon individual liberty. So Jefferson, had notions of, that people would sort of own their own little plots of land, and they could, grow their own food and live off their land, and they could, read books and educate themselves and be happy in their own sort of little world with their family, and achieve sort of spiritual enlightenment and like a nirvana by being able to just basically enjoy their own freedom. So he had this notion that the country would consist of like all these sort of small farmers who would, were living on their own plots of land and, grow their own food and sort of be, masters of their own little domain. And this is how they would achieve enlightenment and fulfillment. So this all sounds great. It's sort of idealistic, though. I mean, many critics point out that Jefferson's view was wonderful and it was inspirational, and to read Jefferson's ideas of pursuing your own liberties and happiness and whatever you'd like to do in life is wonderful, but it's just not realistic. Like Jefferson had this sort of, it's almost a utopian society in mind, with everybody owning just a little plot of land and growing their own food, but nonetheless would be somehow totally happy and totally fulfilled, when it just doesn't seem realistic and practical that you would be able to do that. You would have poverty and you'd have all sorts of problems. But nonetheless, Jefferson still was, he was passionate about this view. He was almost like, the comparison is almost like Jefferson was almost like an artist, sort of dreaming about a wonderful, glorious society, whereas Hamilton was more like a corporate executive, putting in plan these places for economic growth. So these are sort of the different philosophical aspects between Hamilton and Jefferson. So who was right? Which one had the better vision? And I think you have to say that really neither one of them was right or wrong. They were both right and they were both wrong. Both of their visions had tremendous merit to them, but both of their visions also had drawbacks. So Hamilton's vision was, it had tremendous merit to it. I mean, many say that Hamilton's vision is what is responsible for the United States emerging as a global power with so much success, because it was Hamilton that had this vision of putting together this federal government to create this economic development, and that is what enabled America to succeed. And there is a lot of truth to that, right? Without this strong federal government and all these states coming together to form one nation, and the federal government, supporting these endeavors, America would not have grown into the great nation that it has become. On the other hand, Jefferson's ideas of individual liberties are extremely important as well. And that has been a central element in the development of this nation over the centuries. So an important strain in this nation has been trying to preserve and protect individual liberties. So this has sort of been the story of this nation as it has developed, is, sort of the trying to encourage economic development and progress and, improvement in society and the nation, while at the same time trying to preserve individual liberties and freedom. So these two men, their differing philosophies sort of embody the nation as a whole. It's amazing that it started way back when, at the very founding of this nation. So it's pretty incredible. So there were a number of issues at the time that arose that sort of give us a good sense of the differences between these parties, because these issues arose and these parties took very different views on these issues. In fact, they were fighting over these issues. So one issue was the issue of whether the federal government should assume the debts from the Revolutionary War. The debts were held by the states at the time. So this was Hamilton's vision. So Hamilton was advocating this strongly. Hamilton said the federal government should assume the war debts. So basically what this all meant was, so at the time of the Revolutionary War, when it was just beginning, the army needed a bunch of supplies, right? I mean, it needed a ton of supplies. It needed boots and clothes and food and, weapons and ammunition, all sorts of stuff. So in order to get this stuff, the army went to these, businesses around the 13 colonies and said, hey, we need this stuff from you. Can you supply us with boots and clothes? And, so these businesses says, yeah, sure, we'd love to do that. So here's how much it will cost. But the army said, well, we don't have any money. So will you supply them to us anyway, sort of on credit? And the idea is supply them to us now. And so these small businesses had to eat the costs at the time, right? Supplying them basically for free or for only small payments. But the idea was that once we win the war, well, then we'll be a sovereign nation and we'll be able to pay all you back. So these businesses said, okay, so they provided all this stuff to the army. It was basically on credit, right? This was a form of debt. We'll provide it to you now without payment, but the idea is that you have to pay us back when you have the money after you win the war. Okay. So what happened was, after the war, the war was won. All these businesses said, glad the war was won because now I'm really hurting. I really need that money. Please pay me back. But the states said, well, we don't have the money. We can't pay you back, and we're not sure how we're going to get it. We're working on it. We'll keep trying to figure out how we're going to get some money to pay you back, but right now, we can't pay you back. So Hamilton's grand vision was, look, this is a problem in the nation to have all this debt outstanding. All these companies and people all across the nations are, just hanging on by their fingernails, and they're not being paid back their debt. They're facing bankruptcy. This could be a big problem for the nation. But if the federal government steps in and assumes this debt, so the federal government agrees to pay this debt, so to pay all these companies back and these people back around the nation, this will be great because the federal government has a way to generate some money. It has some money to pay back, so it can start making these payments back to all these companies around the nation, and that will stimulate economic growth. First, it will save all these people from bankruptcy, right? And it will stimulate economic growth. So these businesses all around the country will now be starting to getting paid back. They will then be able to make more things, reinvest in their business, hire more people, create more things. This will spur economic development. So this is the whole purpose of the federal government. This is what the federal government should be doing. So this was extremely important to Hamilton and to the nation in taking the next step forward, was to have the federal government assume this federal war debt. So that was one issue. Now, Jefferson and his party were terrified at this, right? They're like, what are you talking about? The federal government assuming all this debt? Right? They were worried that this was going to be a huge obligation, and it would give the federal government more power and control if it was, taking over all this debt. So they were against this. This was a huge issue and a huge battle at the time. So that was one issue that embodied the difference in these two parties, these two visions, right? Hamilton wanted to create this large federal government, and Jefferson and his party wanting to, power to remain local and, concerned about local and individual liberties. So that was one issue, was assuming the war debt. Another issue was the issue of creating a national bank. So Hamilton and his Federalists, they wanted to create a national bank, right? So this would be necessary in order to help facilitate national commerce, right? So the federal government would be able to borrow and lend, and this would help set interest rates, and it would help facilitate the development of businesses around the country and that sort of thing with a federal bank. Again, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans were terrified at this, right? A national bank, what are you talking about? This, again, it just signifies the growth in power of the federal government if they have their own bank. So they were opposed to this, and this was a huge fight back then. Another issue was that Hamilton wanted to implement all of these tariffs. So what tariffs were when a foreign country imports goods into America, it's like customs, like duties. So when they import foreign goods, those foreign goods would be taxed at the border. So the revenue from that tax would then be sent into the federal treasury. And this is how the federal government would raise money for itself. Now, back then, there was no income tax. None. It did not exist. So the federal government really didn't have many ways to raise money for itself. So this was a huge way to raise money. So this was Hamilton's vision for how the federal government would raise revenues, would be through tariffs, duties of taxing imported goods. Now, this was the central way that the federal government raised money for itself for over 100 years until the income tax was enacted in the early 1900s. It was amazing. So the federal tariffs was huge. So you can see Hamilton's vision here, right? The federal government assuming the war debt, creating a national bank, imposing these tariffs to generate revenue, right? So then Hamilton's envisionment here was that the federal government would raise this money and then be able to spend this money around the country to create roads and bridges and facilitate commerce and create manufacturing and create all sorts of economic development that would spur private companies and encourage them to develop and create all these jobs, and pretty soon you would have a strong nation, right? So this is Hamilton's grand vision. But again, Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, were worried about the federal government being able to raise all this revenue through these tariffs, so they were opposed to that. And one more issue that I will mention, the difference between these two parties here, had to do with the proper interpretation of the Constitution. So Hamilton's interpretation was that the Constitution granted the federal government implied powers to do all sorts of things. And Jefferson's interpretation of the Constitution was that no. The only powers that the federal government has are the ones that are specifically enumerated in the Constitution itself. So a great example of this, to illustrate this example, is with the issue of the national bank. So Hamilton wanted to create this national bank, and what Jefferson said, and his party said, he said, no. You can't create a national bank. You don't have the authority to do it. There's no constitutional authority for the federal government to create a national bank. And what Jefferson said was, and his party, they said, pull out your Constitution, pull out the draft of the Constitution and read the text. And nowhere in the text will you find the words national bank. Those words do not exist in the Constitution. And that means that you don't have the authority to create a national bank. Because if you did have the authority to create a national bank, the Constitution would say you can create a national bank. Since those words are not in the Constitution, you cannot create a national bank because you don't have the authority to do it. Hamilton, on the other hand, had a very different view of the Constitution. Hamilton said, no, that's not how the Constitution works. So he said the Constitution is not that detailed. The Constitution didn't go into that level of specificity. It didn't try to specify every single individual thing that the federal government can do. It didn't try to create that bullet list. Otherwise, you'd have a bullet list with millions and millions of points on it. No. It wasn't trying to create that level of specificity. Instead, it was more general. So what the Constitution says is the federal government can do whatever is appropriate in order to carry out the powers that are granted in the Constitution. So Hamilton pointed to a clause in the Constitution, and this today is known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. And what that clause says is, it says that the federal government has the power to create any laws that are necessary and proper in order to carry out what the Constitution has granted in other areas. Okay, so the Constitution has granted certain powers in other places in the Constitution, and not only is the federal government authorized to engage in those powers, right, like create the presidency. These are very specific things in the Constitution: create the presidency and create Congress and create the Senate. Very specific things. Not only is the federal government empowered to do that, but also under this necessary and proper clause, the federal government is also empowered to do anything that is necessary and proper in order to carry out these things. Okay, so what Hamilton said was, look, the Constitution specifies that the federal government can borrow money and raise taxes. Well, it is necessary and proper to create a national bank in order to carry that out. Right? In order to borrow money, you need a national bank. That's how you do it. That's how you would carry this out. So of course the federal government is authorized to create a national bank. And the Constitution doesn't have to include the words national bank, because creating a national bank is necessary and proper in order to carry out what the Constitution was envisioning. Now, this may sound familiar because it is familiar. This is the exact debate that was going on with the Bill of Rights at the time of ratification of the Constitution. And back then, Hamilton had the exact opposite position. Remember, so Hamilton was trying to convince the states back then to ratify this Constitution without a Bill of Rights. So what Hamilton was saying back then is he was saying, you don't need a Bill of Rights, because all the rights that the government has, the federal government has, are right in the Constitution. They're specified right there in the Constitution. So you don't need a separate Bill of Rights that says all the things that the government cannot do, because the Constitution is clear itself, specifying all the things that the government can do. So if it's not specified expressly in the Constitution, then the government cannot do it. But now, Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury. He's leading this charge of the federal government, and now he's singing a different tune. So now Hamilton is saying, no, there are these implied rights in the Constitution. So you don't need to specify every single thing, because it is implied in the Constitution that the federal government has these additional rights. So now it turns out it is a good thing that they created this Bill of Rights. You really do need a Bill of Rights, right? Because if the federal government has all these implied powers to do all sorts of things that aren't necessarily specified in the Constitution, well, now it becomes more important that you have a Bill of Rights that says, okay, notwithstanding anything else, what you cannot do. So you have all these powers in the Constitution, but you cannot do these certain things that are listed in the Bill of Rights. Now that Bill of Rights becomes ever more important, and this is one of the reasons why the Bill of Rights has become such a central element of our Constitution and of our constitutional law over the last couple of centuries, right? So it's amazing. So it's pretty funny here what Hamilton has been arguing. But he turns out to be right, because the Supreme Court ends up validating this position and ends up recognizing, yes, that is how the Constitution was drafted. It does allow the federal government to have these implied rights. The Constitution did not seek to specify every little thing, but it granted these broader powers for the federal government to implement, whatever it needed to do under implied powers. So that was another issue that was, raging between these two parties back then. So this overall issue of the two parties was amazing back then with respect to the size of the federal government. So Hamilton's party, the Federalists, they wanted to create a broad and centralized and powerful federal government, Whereas on the other hand, Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans, wanted a more limited government, and they were focused more on local and individual liberties. Another split between these two parties was whether to support England or France in their war against each other. So England and France were back at it again. I mean, it's amazing. They've been warring against each other for centuries. The history is amazing on that. So what happened this time was in 1793, Napoleon, for France, declared war on England and some other countries as well, Spain, Holland. So these were the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So the question for America was whether to support England or France in this war. Now, America had strong ties with both countries. So England was the stronger trading partner. America was doing more commerce with England. And England had a more stable government. And England also had this, military empire. So for those reasons, it was a good partner to have. France, on the other hand, had just helped America achieve its own independence. France had sent all these soldiers over to help America in the Revolutionary War against England. So for this reason alone, France was a huge ally of America. So France was also undergoing its own revolution now. So this was the French Revolution. So France was seeking its own independence just like America had done a few years earlier. So in the French Revolution, France, the peasants were trying to overthrow the monarchy, their king and queen, and establish their own democratic government. So this was another reason why America wanted to support France. They wanted to support this democratic government. Now, that meant, since France was in the middle of a revolution, that meant that their government was a little less stable. It was an unstable government, whereas the government in England was more stable. But the problem with English government was that it was a monarchy, right? It was this imperial power that, poses threats. So you can see there were differences here, but America had strong reasons to support both countries. So this was somewhat of a dilemma of which country to support. So George Washington, as president, decided that America would remain neutral. Now, this was not pleasing to either England or France, but that was the decision. So despite this official position that America would remain neutral, there were nonetheless significant feelings and splits within the government inside America. So the Federalists favored England, and the Democratic Republicans favored France. So the Federalists they were trying to create this, federal government and encourage economic development. So they liked the idea that England was the stronger trading partner. There was a lot of commerce with England, as well as, England had this powerful military, didn't really want to get involved with a war against England at this time. So, these were reasons for favoring England, but also John Adams, remember, was just the minister to England. So he had just returned from living in London. So John Adams had strong connections and a strong relationship with London. So John Adams was in favor of England. Thomas Jefferson, though, he was just the minister to France. So he had just returned from living in Paris. So Jefferson had all these connections with France. So in fact, while Jefferson was living in France, he established all these relationships with people who were in the revolution. So Jefferson was very much in favor of the French Revolution, and he knew people who were involved in it and who were planning it, and he was encouraging them. So which is pretty interesting. Actually, Jefferson was in Paris when the revolution began. So this was the storming of the Bastille in July of 1789, and Jefferson was in Paris when the Bastille was stormed. Amazing. So he left pretty quickly after that. Just a couple months later, he returned to America. But he always remained supportive of the French Revolution. And this was consistent with, Jefferson's overall philosophy of, freedom and liberty and democracy, all that. So he supported this, this idea of enlightenment, enlightened government here. Now, it should be mentioned that when the French Revolution turned bloody in the Reign of Terror, when the peasants were, guillotining everybody, including innocent people. Jefferson did not favor that. He was not in favor of that level of excessive violence. But nonetheless, he did remain supportive of the revolution overall and the principles of the revolution of achieving freedom and democracy. So that was another issue that divided the political parties here, is whether to support England or France in their war against each other. Another issue dividing these two parties, was whether it was the direction that the nation should take in terms of economic development. So the Federalist Party favored manufacturing and industry and banking. They wanted to create all these roads and bridges and facilitate interstate commerce and commerce among the people and all of that. But those industries were largely in the North. So that posed a little bit of a problem for Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, many of whom were in the South. So their party instead favored agriculture. And this is because the Southern society was based entirely on agriculture, right? These huge plantations and growing crops. So they favored, that they wanted the federal government to sort of lean in a direction towards favoring the industry of agriculture. So that was another difference between these two parties. So let's consider a few things that are going on here. So Alexander Hamilton is becoming extremely influential in the Washington administration. So he is the Secretary of the Treasury, but he is becoming increasingly powerful, and he is doing all sorts of stuff to create a strong federal government. So what does this mean in terms of these parties here? Well, this ends up increasing the conflict between these two parties, because as Hamilton charges forward and creates a stronger federal government, Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans, begin to resist that even more, and it causes them to sort of rebel against the Federalists even more. So these two parties are becoming more and more polarized and more entrenched in their positions. So what does this mean with respect to these other guys? Well, George Washington is firmly behind Alexander Hamilton because Washington believes in this strong federal government. So what about John Adams? Well, remember, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were extremely close. So this is back over a dozen years ago, back at the time of the Declaration of Independence, right? These guys certainly shared a lot and had similar perspectives and, admired each other, and they were very close. But now things are changing because Thomas Jefferson is part of this Democratic Republican Party that is basically taking the position of states' rights and is opposing the federal government. So as a result of this, John Adams does not entirely agree with this position. So these two are growing apart as Jefferson is shifting harder into his party's position. And John Adams doesn't entirely agree with that, but John Adams does agree with some of the Federalist positions, but not all of them. So John Adams kind of shifts into basically no man's land. He shifts towards the Federalist Party, but not entirely in the camp of the Federalist Party. He still disagrees with a lot of what the Federalist Party are doing, and he does not like Hamilton. He's got some big problems with Hamilton. So John Adams sort of ends up in this no man's land. He's almost like an independent here, floating in the middle. So he agrees with some of what the Federalists are doing, but not all of it. And he agrees with some of what Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans, are doing, but not all of it. So he's sort of in the middle here between the two parties. So what about James Madison? Well, remember, James Madison was this guy who was in favor of a strong federal government. Right? He was the father of the Constitution. He was strongly advocating for the creation of this centralized federal government. So what does he do as Alexander Hamilton is gaining more power and Alexander Hamilton is forcefully creating this new federal government? What does James Madison do? Well, what you would think he would do, you expect him to do, is you would expect Madison to follow along with Hamilton's initiatives. So you would expect Madison to become part of the Federalists and support what Alexander Hamilton is doing. But that is not what happens. Stunningly, Madison does not act this way. What happens is Madison takes a look at what Hamilton is doing with creating this federal government, and Madison becomes alarmed. He becomes alarmed. He becomes concerned that Hamilton is going too far and too fast and creating this federal government that has the potential now to threaten the rights of the states. So Madison now becomes concerned. So what does Madison do? Madison does not follow Hamilton. He does not join the Federalists, and instead Madison shifts over and joins Thomas Jefferson. And Madison becomes a member of the Democratic Republican Party, who was in favor of states' rights and who opposes the Federalists. Okay, this is stunning. I mean, Madison was the guy who was advocating in favor of this strong federal government, and now once it's been created, what does he do? He completely reverses himself, shifts over to the Democratic Republicans, and opposes this federal government. It is a complete reversal and a total 180. So what is going on here? Well, one thing is that Madison now is in the Congress, so he is representing the state of Virginia in the United States House of Representatives. So he now has the perspective of a state, right? He's looking at things through the eyes of the state of Virginia. So he feels like he's got to protect the state of Virginia, and he's becoming concerned that this federal government is growing too strong and too powerful, and thus the federal government will be able to override the state of Virginia. So he feels like he needs to protect the state of Virginia, and this is why he shifts over to Jefferson and joins the Democratic Republicans. Now, another factor might be that, remember, Jefferson and Madison have been friends for many, many years. Jefferson was Madison's mentor. So perhaps there's an element here that Madison now is recognizing the wisdom of Jefferson, and Madison is following Jefferson, sort of coming home and rejoining his mentor. So Madison shifts over and becomes a member of the Democratic Republican Party. So let's put a line here, a connector, showing that James Madison shifts over to Jefferson and joins Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. As we consider all these positions that Hamilton had and that Jefferson had, we just can't help but wonder whether they would have been Democrats or Republicans today, right? Would Hamilton be a Democrat today or a Republican today? And Jefferson, would he be a Democrat today or a Republican today? It's certainly a lot of fun to think about. Now, there is a popular notion that Hamilton is the father of the modern day GOP. So the father of today's modern day Republican Party. And similarly, that Jefferson is the father of today's Democratic Party. And there certainly are a lot of reasons to believe that and to support that. So because Hamilton was really about big business, which is the Republican Party today, and Jefferson was really about democracy for more people, which is really what the Democratic Party of today are all about. So there is a lot to support that common notion. But also, once you start looking beneath the surface and considering a number of their other positions, it becomes less clear and it becomes a little more difficult to fit them nice and neatly into these boxes. So, for example, Hamilton. So, there is a lot of reasons to consider Hamilton as a Republican and, the father of the modern day Republican Party, because he was in favor of big business, right? He wanted to, create these incentives for these, corporations and for economic developments. And, he had this, financial sense of creating these financial markets by, issuing bonds and, this sort of stuff. So this is very similar to the Republican Party of today, the party of big business. And also, Hamilton was courting these business people to become members of his party and to support his party. So he was, making friends with wealthy business people and trying to win the support of wealthy business people and trying to build his party, his Federalist Party, with the support of wealthy business people. And this is because his political positions favored wealthy businesses. So this is very similar to the Republican Party of today, right? Most businesses and business people are Republicans, and the Republicans, most Republicans are supportive of the Republican Party. Most business people are supportive of the Republican Party. So this is very similar to today. So in this respect, it makes sense that Hamilton would be a Republican today. However, Hamilton had some positions that would certainly not be popular with the Republican Party of today. In fact, these positions might even get him kicked out of the Republican Party today, right? So one of these positions was that Hamilton loved big government. Hamilton was all about big government, right? So he wanted to create this huge federal government. He wanted the government to have all these powers and to, create all these agencies and all this stuff, right? The Republicans today hate big government. The Republicans are opposed to big government. They're always trying to get rid of big government, slash big government, kill big government, this whole thing. So this position of Hamilton of being in favor of big government would certainly not be at all popular in the Republican Party of today. So another aspect of this was that Hamilton had an expansive reading of the Constitution, right? He believed in all these implied powers, right? He believed that the federal government had all these implied powers under the necessary and proper clause, that the federal government could basically, do what it wanted, right? It could create all these agencies, it could create all these, government bureaucracies, it had a lot of power to do this stuff. The Republicans do not have that perspective. They hate that perspective. The Republicans believe in a close reading of the Constitution and that the government only has the powers that are specifically enumerated in the Constitution and that the government does not have any power beyond that. So when the government creates these programs, the Republicans say, oh, that's unconstitutional, and the government is trampling on the Constitution and all that. So this is another reason why Hamilton's positions would be completely contrary to some of the Republican positions of today. So that's pretty funny there for Hamilton. And we have a similar situation with Jefferson. So in many respects, Jefferson can be thought of today as a Democrat, and the current Democrats of today would revere Jefferson for many of his positions. Like, for example, Jefferson believed in spreading democracy to the most number of people, even the common people, right? So this is different than the Republicans of today. The Republicans of today believe that you should limit democracy. They're always trying to restrict people from being able to vote, that sort of thing. But the Democrats believe in spreading the vote to as many people as possible, and that's what Jefferson believed. So from that perspective, Jefferson was very similar to the Democrats. Jefferson was also like a naturalist, right? He believed in the natural resources. Today it would be an environmentalist, right? So the Democratic Party is more the environmental friendly party. So that aspect of Jefferson would be consistent with the Democratic Party. Jefferson also believed in freedom of religion. One of Jefferson's proudest achievements was that Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. So one of the central tenets enshrined in this Virginia statute is that people should be free to believe in any religion they desired. They should be free to have their own beliefs, and they should be able to practice their religion without discrimination in society. Another central tenet in this Virginia statute is that Jefferson believed in a strong separation between church and state. And basically what this means is that the official government, the state, should not be favoring any one particular religion. Because if the official government favored a particular religion, well then this would discriminate against other people who practiced different religions. So the point is that the government should remain completely neutral when it comes to religion. And in order to remain neutral, the government should not be inclined towards any one particular religion, but instead all people should be treated equally regardless of their religious beliefs. Now, these principles later were incorporated into the founding of this nation. And these principles are now founding principles in our Constitution. And they are reflected in the First Amendment in the freedom of religion. So this is tremendously important, the freedom of religion to Jefferson, and a huge principle in the founding of this nation. Now, Jefferson's beliefs on freedom of religion today would place him more along the lines of the Democratic Party of today than the Republican Party of today. And the reason is because the Democratic Party of today is more diverse in their membership. Their membership is of more different religions. The Democratic Party is more welcoming to people of different faiths. And the Democratic Party also believes in this strong separation between church and state. The Democratic Party does not favor the introduction of religion into the official government functions. The Republican Party of today, on the other hand, is more Christian, and they are more aligned with Christians. And the Republican Party of today is less welcoming to people of different faiths. Also, the Republican Party of today believes in a less strong separation between church and state. And the Republican Party of today favors introducing the aspects of Christianity and Christian religion into government functions. So Jefferson's beliefs of this strong freedom of religion would today likely make him more of a Democrat than a Republican. Jefferson also believed in this sort of self-realization and self-fulfillment concept of, so free education, for example. He believed that everybody was entitled to a free education. So the government would pay to educate everybody. And Jefferson believed this was, a fundamental right, that everybody, in order to realize your potential, you had to be educated, and so the government should provide free education to everybody. And to these ends, Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. And this is the same University of Virginia that we have today. It's amazing. So this is in furtherance of Jefferson's vision of providing an education to everyone. This is a very democratic idea. The Republicans hate it when the government is providing free stuff to anybody. So this belief would also be embraced by the Democratic Party today. So in these respects, Jefferson was very much a Democrat. Also, there's a funny story that FDR, so the President of the United States in the 1930s and 1940s, was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And FDR loved Jefferson. Jefferson was a big hero of FDR, and FDR also felt that Jefferson was, a Democrat. So FDR was instrumental in having the Jefferson Memorial created in Washington, D.C. So this is the huge, magnificent Jefferson Memorial that now stands in Washington, D.C. You can go visit it. It's wonderful. So when the Jefferson Memorial was being built, this was around 1940, FDR was president of the United States. So what he used to like to do is, from the White House, so while FDR was inside the White House, he used to like to look out the window, and he wanted to see the Jefferson Memorial as it was being created and constructed. But there were some trees that were in the way. So FDR had these trees cleared in order to clear the line of sight so FDR could sit in the White House and gaze upon the Jefferson Memorial. Here's a bird's eye view of it. So here's the White House. Got the south lawn of the White House over here, Pennsylvania Avenue. Got the Capitol right here. Got the National Mall along here. The Lincoln Memorial here at the other end of the National Mall. And down here is the site of the Jefferson Memorial. So let's take a satellite look at this. So you got the White House here. Got Pennsylvania Avenue, the Capitol here. Here's the National Mall. You've got the Smithsonian Institution here. Here's the Washington Monument. You can see the shadow of it along the ground there. And you've got the Lincoln Memorial here and the reflecting pool here. And down here is the Jefferson Memorial. So you can just envision it. FDR sitting in the White House here, looking out the window, gazing across the south lawn of the White House, across the National Mall, across the tidal basin, and gazing upon the Jefferson Memorial as it was being constructed. So that's pretty cool. So FDR wanted the trees to be cleared along here in order that he would have a clear line of sight from the White House to the Jefferson Memorial. And interestingly, they maintained that clear line of sight to this day. I love that story. That's a great story, and it shows that that FDR really embraced Jefferson and felt that he had a kindred spirit there in Thomas Jefferson. They were both part of shared the democratic ideals. So that's a great story. But some of Jefferson's positions were not consistent with the Democratic Party of today. In fact, some of his positions would likely get him kicked out of the Democratic Party today. All right, so one thing was that Jefferson believed in states' rights. Okay? Jefferson was all about states' rights. Now, this position is very much a Republican position today. In fact, it's most widely held by the more extreme, radical fringe elements of the Republican Party. The more fringe you get in the Republican Party, the more you believe in these states' rights. The idea is that states can invalidate federal law, and states have supremacy over federal law, right? And in fact, the most extreme is that states could break away and become their own nations. So, but Jefferson believed in states' rights. He was a big advocate for states' rights. So this would certainly not be a position that would be accepted by the Democratic Party today. So another belief of Jefferson was that Jefferson was totally opposed to big government, right? He feared big government. He was afraid of big government. This is very similar to the Republican Party today. The Republican Party hates big government. So Jefferson felt that the government was not entitled to create these, large agencies and create these new programs and all of that. He said no, he was against all of that. So this would not be a popular position in the Democratic Party today. And Jefferson's view of the Constitution. Jefferson was basically a strict constructionist on the Constitution. So he believed you have to read the exact words of the Constitution. And if a power was not in the Constitution, the exact words, then the federal government did not have that power. So he believed in very limited powers to the federal government. So he believed that the federal government could not create, new federal agencies and new federal programs and all of that. He would be all opposed to all of that. And that is certainly more along the lines of the Republican Party. It would certainly not be accepted in the Democratic Party of today. So it's pretty funny with all these conflicting positions of both Hamilton and Jefferson as they relate to the parties today. So as you can see, in some respects it makes sense, just kind of from a big picture perspective. If you don't think about it too much, that you can say Hamilton was more of a Republican and Jefferson was more of a Democrat. But once you really get into it and start considering all the complexities of their positions, you realize that neither one of them really fit neatly within the boxes of today. They don't neatly fit into the political parties that we have today. But nonetheless, it is a lot of fun to think about. These two political parties are becoming increasingly polarized. So with Hamilton leading the Federalist Party and Jefferson leading the Democratic Republican Party. So Hamilton decides to start really increasing support for the Federalist Party. So he goes out and tries to raise support from the business community. So he goes out to these wealthy businessmen and he encourages them to support the Federalist political party, because the federal political party is, makes sense for them to do that because it is pro-business. So Jefferson and Madison are troubled by this, and Jefferson and Madison realize that they need to do something similar in order to counter what Hamilton is doing. So Jefferson and Madison go out and they start trying to raise support for the Democratic Republican Party. Now, just think about being poor old George Washington here. This all must have been very upsetting to Washington, because you've got your Secretary of Treasury creating one political party, and you've got your Secretary of State creating an opposing political party, and they are fighting against each other. Right? So this cannot be a good thing for Washington, and especially when you consider that Washington is a military guy. Right? So he was probably considering these guys as like his generals, his top generals. So you can't be the head of an army and have your two top generals totally fighting against each other, right? So, time goes on and the parties become increasingly opposed to each other. And Jefferson begins to really seriously undermine the initiatives that Alexander Hamilton is trying to create here in pushing forward with creating this strong federal government. Well, George Washington is extremely upset with Jefferson for this. And in fact, Washington probably would have fired Jefferson. But instead, Jefferson resigns. So in 1793, Jefferson resigns voluntarily from his position as the Secretary of State. But Washington is so upset with Jefferson that Washington never spoke with Jefferson again.